World History of Christianity, Chapter 2, Part 3. We are on page 58, right in the middle. The headline is Missionary Expansion and Political Disintegration Surpassing the Empire. There was no intrinsic reason why Christianity should be confined to the Roman Empire, and it never was so confined. Its universalist momentum was bound to take it well beyond even the empire's wide frontiers. If for long it remained largely inside, that was all the same understandable. The ease of communication around the Mediterranean, the presence of a Jewish community in so many towns, the wide expansion of the Greek language all made it natural that the Christian faith, having begun within the empire, should expand particularly there. If its scriptures were quickly translated into languages other than Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Coptic, these were all languages used within the empire. Advance across the imperial frontiers, especially to the east, came, however, quite early, but the fixation of church historians with the Greco-Roman world has led to it being rather little considered. The key point here is Edessa, an independent kingdom until its absorption into the Roman Empire in 241. Edessa and Nisibis, further to the east, became the center of Syriac Christianity, Syriac being a form of Aramaic. Christianity had certainly penetrated into these parts well before 241, as on into Persia. Edessa may well have been the first place in which Christian churches were built publicly, because there was no persecution before the Roman takeover. We know that they existed already in the 2nd century. An important theological school also developed at Nisibis, well across the Persian border. It may well have been from Edessa that the faith was taken north into the kingdom of Armenia and on into Georgia, just as it was carried through Persia and on into India and somewhat later China. All these churches belonged initially to the Antiochene theological tradition, although Armenia was later persuaded to switch more to the Alexandrian. When the Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Armenia became Christian in the 4th century, the hitherto fully tolerated state of Christians within the Persian Empire altered, and they became subject to intermittent persecution. It was therefore important to demonstrate that they were not Roman agents, and while they accepted the Council of Nicaea, they did not adhere to that of Ephesus, with its humiliation of the Antiochene tradition, and in consequence came to be branded Nestorian, though there is no real connection between them and Nestorius. If the Syriac church rejected Ephesus, the Armenian church rejected Chalcedon. Each by so doing asserted its independence from the Byzantine Empire and Greek ecclesiastical hegemony, but the consequent absence of full communion between them may have inhibited the larger movement east. Yet this early wave of evangelization, well beyond the empire's frontiers, undoubtedly brought into being strong local traditions of faith in Armenia, Georgia, Malabar, and elsewhere, which have never ceased to be a significant part of the Christian world. From Egypt and Syria, Christianity also spread south, first to Arabia, and then to the Red Sea kingdom of Aksum, from which Ethiopia developed. The decisive movement here was the early 4th century. A young Syrian from Tyre named Frumentius was among a group of traders captured on their way home from India. Taken into the service of the king, he began to spread Christianity, and then, on reporting this to Athanasius in Alexandria, was consecrated by him as bishop of Aksum. Then, or somewhat later, the king, Izana, became a Christian, and in the following century, the Bible was translated into Ethiopian together with other Christian books, mostly of an Alexandrian provenance. By the early 6th century, Aksum had become a powerful independent Christian state, with its own ecclesiastical tradition, but still linked hierarchically with Alexandria, from where it received its bishops and its monophysite commitment. To the west of Ethiopia on the Upper Nile, Christianity had also penetrated by this time into various small Nubian kingdoms, though we know little about it before the mid-6th century. Where it did not advance in Africa was much further to the west, across the Sahara, from Carthage and Numidia, and for much of the reason for that may well lie in the bitter struggle within the North African Church between Catholics and Donatists, which continued for far more than a century, and turned the efforts of both sides into either convincing or intimidating the other, so that little energy can have been left for encouraging a movement south across the Roman border. In the 4th century, Christianity was still somewhat sparsely represented in many of the northwestern parts of the empire, but we know far too little about its spread in, for instance, Britain, to make very confident assertions about it. This remained an area in which the church was still very much of a minority and present in the towns more than the countryside. It had produced one martyr, Alban, in the Roman city of Verulamium during one or another persecution, and a century later it produced one devout and ascetic but somewhat heretical theologian in the person of Pelagius. Pelagius, however, had left Britain well before his ideas became known. It was in Rome that he acquired his reputation as a teacher of moral theology, but only in Africa, when Pelagius left Rome on account of the Gothic invasion, that he came to be denounced. However, 20 years later, Germanus, the Bishop of Auxerre, made 2 visits to Britain to preach against Pelagianism. By then the legions had gone, while the Germanic invasion had not yet begun, whereas most of Gaul was already under the control of one or another German tribe, almost all of them nominally Aryans. Much of the Gallic countryside had certainly not been deeply Christianized before the invasions, and everywhere the church was in a tottering state, though doubtless still strongest in the south, where it had for so long been best established around Arles, Lyons, Marseille, and the island monastery of Lerins, from which so many of its best bishops came. It was, nevertheless, from the mid-5th century British Church, of which we know so little, that Patrick came to be the evangelist of Ireland, the first major advance in the West beyond what had once been the empire. Whatever urban character may still have survived in the British Christianity of his day, nothing could be carried across to Ireland. Here what mattered could only be tribal leadership and the influence of monastic communities. But much the same would soon be the case in Britain too, as its Christians retreated from conquest by Saxons, Angles, and Jutes west into Wales, while the church in Britain had hitherto possessed the usual town bishoprics common throughout the empire. At London, York, and elsewhere, it was left, when these were all lost to the invaders, with no clear structure of leadership other than that of monasteries and bishops based within them. In fact, this proved, in the long run, a more effective missionary organization. We know almost nothing about the Christian history of Ireland in the first 100 years after Patrick, but clearly the church survived and grew, as did that of Wales, and by the second half of the 6th century was able to expand outwards. Just as monks from the Welsh church in the lifetime of Illtyd and Dufrig, 2 powerful but shadowy figures of the early 6th century, were carrying their mix of asceticism and evangelism to Cornwall and Brittany, so would the Irish go to Scotland, England, and mainland Europe. Columba left Ireland for Iona in 563. Both Welsh and Irish monks clung proudly to the use of Latin, but because their grasp of it was somewhat limited, given their extreme isolation from the rest of the Latin world, it is understandable that they began to write in their own languages as well. Welsh and Irish enjoy, in consequence, the earliest vernacular literatures of Europe. The point is that here in the far west of Europe, just as in the far east beyond Edessa, Christianity was still quite capable of maintaining and spreading itself and proving creative, without the paternal control and protection of an imperial state, without, too, the supervision of the papacy. While in some circumstances both of these umbrellas assisted the mission, in others they could inhibit or twist it. While the picture of the early 6th century Western Church is undoubtedly a somewhat chaotic one, it is not without its brighter sides. In general, the Catholic majority in Italy, Gaul, and Spain had settled down with its German Arian rulers pacifically enough. Only in North Africa did it for a time suffer persecution. Each had come to need the other, and the ecclesiastical gap between the two had the one great advantage that it made the persecution of dissident Christian groups unlikely. The relationship between the papacy and the Ostrogothic monarch based in Ravenna, in particular, for long engendered a certain tolerance upon both sides. The two surviving baptistries in Ravenna, dating from the 5th century, that of the Arians and that of the Orthodox, symbolize the modus vivendi established by Theodoric the Gothic king. The superb basilica of Saint Apollinaire Nuovo, built by him for Arian worship, though after the Byzantine reconquest made into a Catholic church, has an ecclesiastical importance seldom appreciated. It must remain the most splendid church ever built in Italy for other than Catholic use. This balance, however, would not continue. At a still disputed date in the 490s, Clovis, the brutal but successful ruler of the Franks, was baptized by Remigius, the Bishop of Reims, thereby establishing an alliance between the Catholic Church and the Frankish monarchy, which would remain one of the most decisive features in church history until the French Revolution. From then on, the Church and the Gallo-Romans tended to side with the Franks against the Goths and anyone else until, quite rapidly, Gaul began to turn into France. In Italy, the collapse of Arian rule came 50 years later, with the Emperor Justinian's vast strategy of recovering the Western Empire. Italy was devastated, but Ostrogothic rule destroyed, and with it an official Arian presence, which had held the institutional hegemony of Catholicism at bay. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa had already fallen to Justinian's army. From then on, the Catholic Church would have no Christian rival, but would instead, within a century, have to face the far greater peril of Arab-Muslim invasion. If we take a last look at the way things stood around 525, we see a Rome which had managed to weather the storms of the previous century tolerably well. The very confusion of the secular order had helped recognition of the need for a Roman jurisdictional authority throughout the Church in the Latin West, an authority to be regularly exercised. That would not have been the case in the 4th century. Indeed, for a moment, recognition went far further than that. Hormisdas was pope from 514 to 523. It was a Persian name, but he was at least born in Italy. He is the only pope whose son, Silverius, later became pope too. Like every pope of the period, he needed to walk a tightrope between the emperor in Constantinople and the Ostrogothic king in Ravenna. For producing the Acacian schism with Rome, which made the popes more friendly toward the Goths. For some years, Constantinople had veered back toward monophysitism, producing the Acacian schism with Rome, which made the popes more friendly toward the Goths. In 518, however, the Emperor Anastasius died, to be replaced by the pro-Roman Justin. The result was the most striking reconciliation in history between the two traditions, in which the formula of Hormisdas was solemnly signed at Constantinople in the imperial palace by the Patriarch and some 250 Eastern bishops. This statement not only reaffirmed the doctrinal teaching of Chalcedon and the Tome of Leo, but emphatically asserted the unique authority of the Roman pontiff in a way that was unprecedented. However, if reconciliation of a sort between Constantinople and Alexandria under Anastasius brought schism with Rome, reconciliation between Constantinople and Rome under Justin could only further alienate Alexandria. Moreover, monophysitism had been spreading, and much of the old patriarchate of Antioch now supported it. Thus, Severus, a monk educated in Alexandria, had been made Patriarch of Antioch by Anastasius. Deposed by Justin together with 55 other bishops of the Patriarchate, he fled back to Alexandria, from where he authorized the establishment throughout the East of a rival anti-Chalcedonian church. Meanwhile, Hormisdas' reconciliation with Constantinople inevitably upset the Ostrogoths. While Rome and Byzantium were in schism, Ravenna could feel reasonably sure of the loyalty of Italian Catholics, especially the old senatorial families whose influence was still so considerable around Rome. Most distinguished among them was Boethius. He had held the honor of the consulate, was utterly fluent in Greek, and apart from serving King Theodoric as master of the offices, had translated a whole series of philosophical works into Latin. He now fell under suspicion of conspiracy, was imprisoned, and then executed in October 524. While awaiting death, he composed one of the great classics of the early Middle Ages, The Consolation of Philosophy, the last work written by a Western Christian to breathe the living air of classical culture. There were very few people in the West who could still read Greek. That is why Pope Gelasius, at the beginning of the century, had appointed a monk from Scythia named Dionysius Exiguus, or Dionysius the Short, to work in his archives translating document. Dionysius was a friend of Boethius and skilled in the art of calculating the right date for Easter. This led him on to construct an entirely new way of counting the years, so as to begin with the birth of Christ. It was around 525 that he invented the concept of the Christian era, the years of the Lord, Anno Domini, A.D. There was no necessity to do this, practical as it has proved, and years could be calculated in many other ways. But it is because Denis had his bright idea, working in his Roman scriptorium in 525, that the whole world is now so preoccupied with the passing of the second millennium. At the time, however, no one paid much attention. His manuscript was passed to his friend Cassiodorus, and eventually, 200 years later, the English monk Bede read what he wrote, adopted the system, and popularized it through his book, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Cassiodorus was another member of the Roman aristocracy who served the court of Ravenna. When the Byzantine army invaded Italy, he retired into private life and later founded the monastery of Vivarium on his estate near Naples. At Vivarium, he too did his best to build up a center of study and arranged for numerous Greek books to be translated into Latin. Boethius, Denis, and Cassiodorus were just about the last generation in the West which felt at home in the Greek world as well as the Latin, and it was a very small group which still did so. The Byzantine Gothic War devastated Italian society more than anything that had gone before. While Justinian's reconquest was a military success, it proved a social disaster. If the central agenda of church politics in the century after Chalcedon was how to hold together Rome, Constantinople, and Alexandria, and Constantinople in the middle had veered back and forth between the one and the other, in the end it effectively lost both. Communion between Rome and Constantinople continued unquestioned for many hundreds of years, apart from fairly brief schisms, but mutual understanding, confidence, a shared theology continually grew less as the logic of politics, culture, and language separated the one from the other. Yet it was too late to restore the Constantinopolitan Alexandrian axis either. Distrust between Chalcedonians and Monophysites had simply grown too deep. Moreover, once both Jerusalem and Alexandria fell to Arab invasion and were definitely separated from Byzantium, there was little secular reason left even to try. At much the same time as Boethius was beheaded and Denis the Short invented the Christian calendar, a British monk may have sailed in a tiny boat from Cornwall to Brittany. Samson came from South Wales. Ordained by Defrygg, he was for years abbot of a monastery on Caldey Island, off the coast of Pembrokeshire. Later, it seems, Defrygg consecrated him a bishop and sent him across the sea to serve the churches dependent on Welsh monks far to the south of Caldey. He first went to Cornwall, then via the Scilly Isles to Brittany, where he founded further monasteries and became Bishop of Dole. He even attended a council in Paris in 557, signing his name Samson Peccator Episcopus, a bishop, but a sinner. Again, on the eastern frontier of Christianity, towards the end of the 5th century, or early in the 6th, a group of Syrian monks, the 9 Saints, traveled south to establish monasteries in the newly converted country of Aksum. Perhaps they were anti-Chalcedonians, fleeing the enforcement of orthodoxy by Justin. We do not know. But they founded a number of monasteries in the hinterland of Eritrea, including Dabra Domo, some of which still survive as monastic communities today, and surely contributed to the translation of Christian texts, the Bible, the writings of Cyril of Alexandria, and much else into Ge'ez. Boethius and Cassiodorus were highly civilized gentlemen, survivors within an ever more restricted society, cherishing its continuity with the imperial past. They would have seemed different indeed from the strange figures who traveled in their little boats from Cornwall to Brittany, or up into the mountains of Ethiopia, yet all alike were concerned with a work of translation of Greek into Latin, or Ge'ez, of Latin into some Celtic or Germanic tongue, and Cassiodorus at Vivarium as much as Samson at Chaldae or Aragawi at Damo, saw the future of the church, especially in terms of founding a monastery, a center of prayer and books. Rome and Constantinople could still look central enough to our story in the early 6th century, and the breathtakingly beautiful cathedral of Hagia Sophia at Constantinople was about to be built, the quintessence of Greek Christianity. But who could judge what in reality would prove central, what peripheral? From Patrick in the 5th century to Boniface in the 8th, the remote western islands of Britain and Ireland, so apparently peripheral, were in fact the missionary center of the Western Church, while Bede, quietly inhabiting his Northumbrian monastery, would so litter his work on the history of Christianity and the English people with dates, Anno Domini, that he successfully transformed our whole way of conceiving the past in its unity. If he took the idea from Denis in Rome, he applied it as no one in Rome had quite the vigor to do. So too, when a century later Alfred, having saved his little West Saxon kingdom, from the destruction by pagan Danish invaders, which had overtaken every other part of the English church, set about translating Boethius on the consolation of philosophy into English. Together with Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care and Bede's Ecclesiastical History, he was being faithful to the task of carrying on a tradition through the work of translation, just as Boethius himself had done. The shape of things as we see them in the early 6th century is that of a still extremely confident, bureaucratically sophisticated, and city-based Christian Greek empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. In political and cultural, even ecclesiastical terms, Constantinople was the secure center of the Christian world, near to which every ecumenical council had hitherto been held. The Gospels had been written in Greek, the Creed defined in Greek, the Roman Empire had been converted into a Greek one and a Christian one. Everything else must have seemed provincial, if not peripheral. Contrast that picture with one of the West, of people in hard and uncertain times desperately struggling to rescue what they could of a tradition they cherished, while at the same time shaping a new pattern of Christian presence, which would change in its essentials rather little for several centuries. It had to live with insecurity, the regular sack of cities, even of Rome, the rise and fall of many a monastery. It was a pattern more of the country than of the town, yet it still possessed the strength of a network of bishoprics constructed on an urban hypothesis and held together by the occasional council of bishops and the sense that they were all in communion with the Pope in Rome. It was a pattern whose vitality and attraction depended enormously on being the sole possessor and communicator of literacy, of the power of the book. But almost more decisive in the struggle to Christianize the West was the power of the holy man, a multitude of Samsons, unthinkable without the monastic movement, but unthinkable too without a sort of peregrinatory evangelicalism, which went well beyond the normal frontiers of early monasticism. They sanctified the geography of Western Europe and captured the imagination of illiterate rural populations. It was holy men, not kings or emperors, who made some sort of rough Christianization of Europe a reality over the next few centuries. When Samson became Bishop of Dole, Cassiodorus founded Vivarium, and Benedict Montecassino, this process was only just beginning. The collapse of Christianity rather than its reconstruction could have seemed most probable, and yet, in reality, it stood poised on a decisive frontier, just beginning to break through into a new age, when its history would be empowered from Paris and London, Ireland and Germany, when Latin would be accepted unquestioningly as the Church's characteristic tongue, and when, in consequence, a huge, if for long unformulated problem would arise as to how this new church could relate to its Greek elder brother. This ends chapter 2.